Now, I recommend if you have a Bible, you leave it open to the book of Ecclesiastes. I will occasionally direct you to jump to another verse. So if you could have that open, that would be good. So what's the point of life? And what is the meaning? Why do you keep getting up every day? Why do you bother going to work every day? Why did you come here? 5 times across to the book of Ecclesiastes, it says, eat, drink, and be merry. You thought that was a secular thing, but no, it's an Ecclesiastes thing. And if you ask parents what they want for their children, often it's not types of jobs and where they're going to live. They'll say, I just want them to be happy. That's kind of what we want, isn't it? Eat, drink, and be merry. But what makes you happy? Is it planning for a holiday? Or maybe planning your garden? Or maybe, for me, I love woodworking. So up here is a homework desk that I recently made, and I love looking for a hole in my furniture, planning, designing, measuring, building, polishing, using a rolling desk with slots for the 3 kids to stick their computers. I love it. That makes me so happy. When things go according to plan, it's satisfying. But what about when the plans don't work? A woodworking cut gone wrong and now your joints aren't square and there's a crack. A holiday gone wrong, flooded in, bushfired or blizzarded. Or recently my mother decided to plant a whole bunch of winter vegetables on a little garden mound outside her house, and she was so happy with this plan. And that night the kangaroos were so happy with the extra food. Sometimes things don't go according to plan. But it's not just our desire to plan and organize and control that leads to happiness. There's our expectations, and are they met or not? So I want you to compare 2 meals. The first, the expectations were high. My parents were taking my 3 and my brother's 3 girls out to dinner, a local restaurant, barbecue ribs, oh, so tasty, expensive. Expectations high, it took an hour and a half. My niece's plate didn't come. The food was cold. Can you guess how satisfied we were? Or, here's the second meal. About 2 summers ago, we went driving across the bottom and then up into the middle of Australia. And a lot of our meals on that trip were a bottle of water, half a box of crackers, an apple, maybe a slightly squashed ham and cheese sandwich. Expectations on that food? Pretty low. Satisfaction? Oh, it's good. The problem with life, there are 2 big problems. We think it will go according to our plans, but so often it doesn't. And we think it should live up to our expectations, but it regularly fails to. And that is a major letdown of life. How are we meant to be satisfied and happy when we keep getting let down? What's the meaning then? And I kind of feel like life is a bit like a roller coaster or a swinging pendulum. You start up here with all of your hopes and your plans, and then reality crashes into you, and you're dashed, and your hopes or your plans are messed up. And then you swing back and make some new hopeful plans, and this hopeful search for meaning is behind much of our efforts to make this world a bit more like heaven. So we look to education problems, thinking maybe if we can just get good education things, it will solve our drug and alcohol, or remove obesity, or solve unemployment. Just more programs. Somebody write another program for us. Or we look to scientific advances. You know, if we could just get the science, maybe we could cure cancer, or stop global warming, or improve the Australian soil enough so that we can cope with the droughts. Or we look to entertainment and leisure psychologists. Maybe they can give us a positive mental health, a strong emotional resiliency. Or we look to money. Money, then I can buy things, the things I want, and I can give things to my children. And all of these are kind of secular expectation of how to fix life's pains. But we live in this world, so we get infected by this way of thinking. And even then we start to think, maybe the church will fix it for me. Yes, The church services will be entertaining and fulfill my generational needs for just the right music. Or we expect that our church family will read my mind and know miraculously when to sweep in and help me. In one of the churches we've worked in, there was a couple, and every time they got home from the hospital, they would ring up my husband as the pastor and give him a piece of their mind, because how dare he not come and visit them? Do you know the only problem was? They didn't tell him they were in hospital. And they were almost all planned to go have a test thing, be there for a couple of days. They just expected that he should know and come and meet them. Expectations. You might even expect that God will answer your prayers just the right way, the way he should do. And so our pendulum swings from our hopeful expectations and plans back crashing into reality. Expectations dashed. And what does the book of Ecclesiastes have to tell us about the meaning of life, about this question? Well, if you have a look at those first few verses that were read out to us, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Oh. And what does man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? Meaningless. No gain. Well, that's a bit of a letdown, isn't it? That doesn't meet our sense of expectation. And where's the satisfaction in that? Well, I'm going to answer those questions, but before we do, we need to have a bit of an idea of what kind of book is this. Because when you launch into studying a book, you need to figure out its setting and its genre. And so what do we know about Ecclesiastes? Well, probably the better question is, what don't we know? Because we don't know a specific date for when it was written, and therefore we don't know the audience to whom it was written. We know that somebody, some unknown author, collected the words of the teacher. You see that he's doing that in verse 1. The words of the teacher, son of David, king of Jerusalem. And you see that again later in the book. The unknown author who kept these words for us. And we're not even 100% sure who the teacher is. It's probably Solomon. That's the way he's introduced. And there are enough hints in there, the wisdom and the riches. But there are other hints that maybe it's not Solomon, but somebody writing from many different perspectives. So there's a lot we don't know, but there are several things we do. We know that this book was preserved for us throughout church history and the movement of the Holy Spirit to be in God's inspired word, useful to teach and rebuke and correct us. Even though it's not a favorite book for many, it's in here. And we do know that the teacher who wrote to us wrote from many different perspectives, from the richest king to the poorest poor, from the powerful to the oppressed, from the wise to the foolish, from the careful righteous to the party boy. We heard a bit of that read out in chapter 2. Did you catch that? And you think, well, what's the good of that? There is an immense blessing in having something written from different perspectives. Have you ever been struggling over how to make ends meet and really troubled over how are you going to get your little bit of money to cover? And somebody who's got quite a bit comes in and says, there, darling, you know, money doesn't satisfy. And you go, yeah, right, how do you know? When I was a teenager growing up in the church, I had my parents and the youth leaders and all of these older monogamous people saying, safe sex for marriage is the best way. And I had all of my peers, and this carried into uni too, saying, you gotta be kidding. It's the best thing since sliced bread. Why aren't you doing it? And I'm sitting there thinking, well, these guys obviously have no clue what monogamy is like. And these guys obviously have no clue what that's, how do I know? But if you have a teacher who teaches from multiple perspectives, we can trust the message. And so while there's much we don't know about Ecclesiastes, there is great comfort and meaning to be gained from it. The other thing about the book of Ecclesiastes is that it's part of the wisdom literature. Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. It's a collection of writings that are largely poetic, so that sometimes the verses come in halves and they'll explain each other. But also it's a collection of writings that likes to tell you how life should work. In general, if you live things God's way, it'll go well for you. which does put Ecclesiastes at a bit of odds with the rest of the wisdom literature books. It's different. It says you can live God's way and things might still not work. The teacher isn't giving us simple Sunday school answers or trite religious answers. He's letting us have a look into his journey, investigating the rough edges, the tricky bits of life, and saying, I've tried it all, trying to figure out what really matters and what works, and here's what I've discovered. And at times it looks almost like it's up and down and confusing and contradicting, but flow with it. It is a different book, but it is a very valuable book. So back to our question. What does Ecclesiastes tell us about the meaning of life? Well, chapter 1, verse 2, meaningless. The Hebrew word there is hebel, which can be translated as breath or vapor. And there are three main nuances or connotations of this word hebel. The first is that it's something insubstantial. It leaves no lasting impression, and it's gone. Life is a little bit futile or pointless because it doesn't last. It doesn't really make anything new or different. And you heard that in the poem that was read out in chapter 1. You've got generations coming and going. Sun gets up, gets down. Wind blows over there, blows back. The whole water cycle. Did you pick the water cycle in there? It's there. Up and down and round and round. You never see enough, you never hear enough, and you're just really tired and nothing's ever new. Hebel. Futile, no lasting impression. Do you feel that sometimes your life is caught in a couple of pointless cycles? When I was a mother of younger children, it was the pick up the toys cycle. No sooner do you pick them all up and put them away than another bunch comes out and hebel. A mother of teenage children, I can put aside a couple of hours to edit an essay. And I think, yes, but there are 3 of them and they have multiple subjects. And then there's another essay and another essay and another essay. Hebel. As a working woman, you're trying to clear all of my tasks that come into my inbox. And before I finish, ding, 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 ding. Hebel. New tasks are coming in. The second meaning of hebel, breath or vapor, is that it's elusive. It resists our efforts to control them. And you see that again in that poem, the wind. You can't catch and hold it. You can feel it, but you can't make it go where you want it to. Otherwise, we could direct all the wind to blow the rain clouds to just the right spots and it'd be sweet. But we can't. It's elusive and resists our effort to control it. We can't even make anything new or make ourselves be remembered in verses 9 to 11. Now, I feel that often with my children. I can't control them. I can't make them like chores. I can't make them choose healthy peer groups. There's so much. I can't protect them from bullying or disappointment. I feel this as a kind of growing up adult who now has some aging parent figures. I can't control when a health crisis will happen and I need to stop everything and plan for aged care. I can't control that. Maybe you've experienced that. And you see this sense of elusiveness resisting our effort to control again in chapter 2. So flip over to chapter 2, verses 16 to 17. For the wise man, like the fool, will not be long remembered. In the days to come, both will be forgotten. Like the fool, the wise man too must die. So I hated life, because the work that's done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. You can't control or escape death or be remembered. We aren't in control. Life is hebel. And the third connotation of this word is absurd. It defies meaning. You can't make sense of it. And at first blush you think, why? Why absurd? That doesn't seem to fit with the others. But it does, because there is so much that we can't understand. Like, I can feel it. I know about the atomic makeup and the gaseous exchange of my breath, but there is so much I don't know, and I can't iron out and explain. And life is like that. There is much we've learned. We're a pretty advanced species, aren't we? I mean, look at us in here with all our technology and double PowerPoints, but there is so much we cannot understand. The teacher felt that. The more he studied, the more pain he felt. Have a look in chapter 1, verse 13. I devoted myself to study, to explore by wisdom everything that's done under the sun. So he's trying to figure it all out, but he can't. Verse 15, straighten out what's crooked and fill up what's lacking. He can't answer all of life's questions. And then verse 16, I thought to myself, look, I've grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone else who's ruled in Jerusalem before me. But what's the bottom conclusion? End of 17. This too is chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Have you ever found that? The more you learn, the more questions you have. The more you dive into something, the more uncertainties you discover. Go figure why life should work that way. You have that go figure, that absurdity reaction later on in chapter 2. Chapter 2, 18. There's a nice guy there. He's worked all his time and got all of his stuff. He says, I have to leave it to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether he'll be wise or a fool, yet he's going to have control over all the things I poured my effort and skill in. This too is meaningless. Go figure. Why should it work like that? And this perspective, this absurdness, is what sets Ecclesiastes so much apart from the other wisdom literature. Remember I mentioned that whole premises that if you live God's way, it should work for you? That's the way most of the wisdom literature is set out. You see that in Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked. You know, his delight is in the law of the Lord. And what's going to happen? God will make him like a tree, sturdy. And whatever he does, it prospers. Oh, but not so the wicked. If you don't live things God's way, now you're like chaff that blows in the wind. The way of the wicked will perish, for the second half of that psalm. Sometimes you can feel like you are delighting in the law of the Lord, and yet your life is still a bit like chaff blowing in the wind. Life is chabel, a little bit absurd. It refuses to be packaged up in neat and tidy packages. Have you ever held a verse up to God and said, hey, explain this right now? I have. And the teacher certainly has. Life is chabel. It can seem to defy meaning. Now, our culture is based on a sense of optimism. Given enough time, humanity can achieve anything. We're such a good species. But I think there's a bit of pessimism creeping in. There's a political pessimism. Can we ever escape the Donald Trumps of politics? There's a social pessimism. Can we ever fix the damages of racism? There is a Christian pessimism. Can we stop church folks from fussing? And if you think you can, just try being a music coordinator for a while, and that'll cure you of that illusion. And then there's a biblical pessimism. Here in the book of Ecclesiastes, God tells us life is chabel. Now, I found this message quite confronting, because I'm more of an optimist than a pessimist, and it makes much more sense to me to focus on the lovely verses of God's peace and his control, and everything will work out fine. Put your hope here. I like that. So the first time I looked through the book of Ecclesiastes, it's like, why would I want to? Why would I want to wrestle with a message that is so confronting and uncomfortable? And I want you girls to have a firm answer to that question before we get too far into this book. I think there are three reasons, and they're all kind of related. The first is it's about being honest. so that people around us aren't alienated by a plastic religion. Life isn't all pretty. Honesty demands that we wrestle with Ecclesiastes. It's also a reality check. There's a modern fairy tale, and most of our world is buying it. Are you ready for it? You can gain financial independence and material satisfaction. It's on all the programs, all the advertisements. We need the reality check of Ecclesiastes because it's just a fairy tale. It's not. Life doesn't work that way. And the third reason, it's about learning how to hold the good with the bad. It's a mark of emotional maturity when you can hold the good with the bad, because often children don't do it. So I'm going to give you an illustration of what I mean by this. It was the way it was first explained to me. And that is, imagine that I've had a lovely afternoon playing with my young child, about 10 years ago when he was a young child. And we spent the whole afternoon playing Lego or blocks or something else fun and glorious. And it's been a fantastic afternoon. Right up until about 10 minutes before I know Daddy's going to come home, and I'll say, okay, it's time to pack up. Ah! Oh, it's a lovely afternoon, but crash and burn in the pack up. And then Stephen comes home and says, oh, Richard, how was your afternoon? Terrible! Why? What happened? Mommy made me pack up. A whole good afternoon dropped because of a bad pack up. Failure to hold the good with the bad. And we can all identify with that. You've probably seen kids do that. But you know, adults still do it. Just a bit more subtly, and unfortunately, far more damage is done. So picture with me an adult child who had an abusive home. But she knows she loves her parents, so she can't acknowledge that ugliness. And so she can't grow through it. Or, on the flip side, an adult child who's come from an abusive home who is so focused on that pain that they can't acknowledge any good or any love. Failure to hold the good with the bad. And it can have tragic consequences if you're living a dishonest or an unreality-checked worldview. We have to learn how to hold with the good with the bad. Otherwise, we end up throwing away all of our lovely afternoons just because of the bad pack-up. So, let's go through the effort of learning the messages from the book of Ecclesiastes. Life is chabel, and it has two main applications to our lives. No gain and no control. So the first one, life has no profit. Let's have a look again at chapter 1, verse 3. What does man gain from all his labor, which he toils under the sun? And then if you have a look at, flick through the bits in chapter 2 where he was trying everything. He tried wine, he tried projects, building projects. He built or owned just about everything there is to build or own, and had gold and silver and people, sex on tap. That's the harem and the delights of men. Everything he wanted, he had. But look at verse 11. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. This gain is about having something left over, a profit, something you can hold on to and say, looky, looky, it's mine. But the teacher faces the reality here that at the end of the day, he doesn't have anything to say, looky, looky. And you see that a bit in those verses later on in chapter 2, where the fellow who worked had to give it all away. In verses 18 to 22, it's just meaningless. Who knows who gets it after death strips it away from you? And further still, verses 22 to 23, what does a man get for all the toil and anxious striving with which he labors under the sun? All his days is work and pain and grief. And even at night, his mind does not rest. This too is meaningless. Have you ever lain awake at night trying to figure out how to make life work? You can't. No profit. We work to get money, to get things, and things get stripped away in drought or business crashes or death. And so things cannot give us inner satisfaction. And we know that workaholism is rebel, but it is so pervasive in our culture. And if you're not convinced it is, just try being a stay-at-home mom or a retired woman, and people say, what do? Oh, you've got no meaning if you don't do, and do more, and do more, and do more, and climb the ladder. Habel, chasing gain. Now, I really, really want to own a house. We don't. We don't own a house. We live in a church manse. But my brothers both have a house. And we've saved enough money, we could nearly buy a house outright, but I don't own a house. I want one. And about 13 years ago, when it was a really big thing for me, I really wanted a house. I was worried about World War III happening, and I thought, even if I don't get a house, can we just buy a bit of dirt so that I know I could go pitch my tent there and have, what was I doing? I was seeking gain, profit, something I could feel secure about. But my husband was convinced that because of his job in the church and everything else, that it just wasn't the right thing for us. And so I submitted, and we put it into a managed fund just before the global financial crisis. So it's a jolly good thing I had processed that need for gain. Otherwise, I really would have been staying up at night a lot looking at those figures. It took 6 years of paying in every month to get back to where we started. Life is habel. You cannot get lasting gain or profit. Does your life reflect that? Or are you still falling for the fairy tale that things will satisfy? Our Western society is based on a cycle of dissatisfaction. You work, you earn, you purchase, you consume, or it breaks. So you work harder to get some more money so that you can purchase some more so that you can consume and it breaks. And you listen to ads that say you're no good unless you've worked and earned and purchased and consumed. And so we do, around and round. And it goes against all of our expectations that we cannot get gain. But this is just a symptom of an even greater loss, the loss of control. As I mentioned at the beginning, we all have this tendency to assume we're in control, and that's why we like planning, and we like it when our plans work. There's a website, www.takingcontrol.com. There's a book by Pauline Salvucci, Take Control of Your Life. Here's a quote off healingwell.com. Midlife may bring unexpected challenges, but that doesn't mean you can't be in control of your life. As human beings, we are hardwired to be in charge of ourselves and our environment. Now, I know that my choices do have a huge impact on my mental and my physical health. I know that. And so in some small ways, you could say I have a degree of control. But don't confuse that little bit of control for all of life. It is so limited. So much of what happens to me is beyond my control. And if we listen to the psychological, philosophical, self-help babble, we'll think, aha, I can control it all. I can change my destiny. I can create the reality I live in. But it's just an illusion. Sometimes we even think we get that message from the church. If you really believed, if you truly had faith, if you're willing to truly sacrifice, as if you were going to manipulate and control God's answers to your prayers. These claims for control are an illusion, and the picture we find in Ecclesiastes is far closer to reality. And you see that loss of control all over the book. We touched on it in chapter 1, 9 to 11. You can't make anything new. You can't be remembered. In chapter 1, 15, what is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. No matter how much humanity tries to fix this world, it can't be fixed. It is caught in the tragedy of sin. And in chapter 2, 18 to 23, we can't even control what happens to our money. It's a chasing after the wind. This message that I'm not in control probably hit me hardest of the book because I like control. I'm a little bit of a control freak, slightly obsessive, compulsive, perfectionistic. I take control in groups. If you want to torture me, put me in a group and tell me I have to submit to a disorganized leader. That'll do it every time. And because I long for control, I hunt through the Bible trying to figure out, okay, so if I do this, that'll work. And if I do this, yep. And if I memorize this, and I'm looking for control. But I don't get it. And so what am I meant to do? What are you meant to do in this world where we have no gain and no control? Well, I think there are three possible reactions, D, R, and S. And you all know the doctor's ABCD from first aid, or if you don't, it's a memory thing that helps you remember the first three items there, D, R, S. I'm going to give you a new memory aid today, a new DRS. And the new DRS is despair, rail against God, or submit to his control. And even if you think, well, of course I'd choose S, I still want you to pay close attention because the next time life crashes into you, you need to re-choose D, R, or S. So let's have a look at despair. Chapter 2, verse 20. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. See, the teacher was there. He saw that as an option. And it kind of makes sense. You know that new game show, Pointless, that they're advertising, where the most obscure answer wins the day? Well, here's the thing. We're pointless, and there's no prize. Sorry for spoiling the end of the story there. That is such a letdown, isn't it? But the trick is, over and over in Ecclesiastes, there's a little phrase, under the sun. If you're an atheist or an agnostic, despair is a natural reaction. You look around life under the sun and you think, ugh. But we're not stuck with under the sun. We know above the sun. We know about God and Jesus coming real into this world. And if the teacher could get to the conclusion of rejecting despair, which he does by chapter 11 to 12, third talk, you'll believe me, he really does reject it. How much more can we, since we have all these extra bits? We have the story of Jesus and all the rest of the history of how God worked through his people and through the early disciples. So I want you to reject the option of despair. So D's gone. Let's check out R. Rail against God. Get angry in frustration. The teacher does that too. Chapter 2, verse 18. I hated all the things I toil for under the sun. Chapter 2, verse 23. All his days and work is pain and grief. Vexation, the way one of the other translation puts it. It's just a frustrating nightmare. Or my personal favorite, have a look at chapter 5, verse 13. This phrase occurs a couple of times in the book. Chapter 5, 13. I have seen a grievous evil under the sun. Not just another, oh, too bad, or that was a bit disappointing, wasn't it? A grievous evil. Really cranky. And that happens a few times in the book. And that's kind of a natural response when things don't go right. And we think, well, that's just not fair. And I've seen Christians do it when they try to change a proverb into a promise. Like, train up your child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. That's a proverb, not a promise. Even Psalm 1. Delight in the law of the Lord, and everything you do will prosper. It's a proverb, not a promise. So the next time you start to feel life's not fair, what are you really saying? You're saying, well, if you just put me in charge, I'd fix it. If you could just let me control it. I did everything, God. I prayed. I served my church. I was faithful to my husband. Not like Sheila over there. But I did all that. How come it's not working out for me? I'm sorry, Sheila. I'm really sorry. When you rail against God, it's an attempt to gain control you don't have. It won't work. We need to reject it. If you're willing to admit that God is there and in control, R is not a good option. So let's go for S. Submit to his control. And we're going to hear lots more about this in the next two talks. But for now, just look at the end of chapter 2. A little peek. Chapter 2, verses 24 to 26. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. See, God's in control. He's the one calling the shots. He's the one who does the giving. On our own, there is no gain, no satisfaction, chabel. But with God, we can have the gift, eat, drink, and find satisfaction. Apart from God, not so pretty. Look at verse 25. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? So you need to be in the submitting camp with God. You need to be the one who pleases God, not the one who frustrates him. Verse 26, to the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. So even though we can see the picture, we won't understand it all. Did you catch the little Habel phrase coming through there again at the end of 26? It's about holding the good with the bad. And then you say, well, who is the one who pleases God and the one who gets it all plucked away from him? It's not enough just in these few verses, but as you look through the book of Ecclesiastes, it becomes clear. The one who pleases him is the one who submits to his control. The one who acknowledges you cannot get gain or profit, and there's no point railing against your maker, and chooses to accept life as a gift. In contrast, the other dude, that's the one who's still chasing gain and chasing control. And what little he manages to grasp up and snatch from life will be taken away and redistributed to the one who pleases God. So next time life disappoints you, and I guarantee you it will, whether you lose your job or your investments are halved, or your doctor gives you bad news, stop, reassess. What is life really about? None of this lasts. None of this can give you inner satisfaction. Is it worth all the time and effort you're pouring into it? That's an important one for the working woman to ask, and the working man. What's your primary goal in life? Is it essentially a secular goal to make sure you can pursue pleasure and status and good children and good homes and financial independence? Or is it to submit to God, to respect him, and choose to obey him even when life doesn't make sense? Life is chabel. That could be a crushing letdown, a tendency to despair. It could be a source of bitterness and frustration, and you want to rail against God. Or it could be a helpful corrective that lets you honestly face reality, that lets you let go of your need for control and gain, and live each day as a gift from God. And then you'll find yourself in chapter 2:24. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. We'll unpack what that looks like. But for now, this is the meaning of life.